I'm lucky that autobiography. Mine is a murder mystery, and this is my third manuscript. I have published some short stories, but not a book at this point. This story takes place in Chatham. A dead body is found by a teenage girl, Beth, on the beach, on Forest Beach Road. And the story talks about her life with her grandmother. Her mother is an ex-addict, and a nearby neighbor who is a lawyer, a crusty character who works to solve this murder. But the excerpt I'm going to read you is at a time when Beth is kidnapped. And she is taken to a hut or a cottage in the woods, and she's questioned by an evil fellow, Sinatra is his name, and she doesn't give up any information. And Sinatra calls on his tough guy, Varn, to deal with her, and that's where it starts. Varn pounded up the front steps and pushed through the screen door. Out of breath, he still managed to grunt. "She ready for me, Mr. Sinatra?" By way of answer, the man held his arm out toward Beth, palm up in the universal sign for "Be my guest." She shrank into the corner as Varn grabbed her by the hair and yanked hard, making her cry out. Another grunt. "That's nothing!" Varn pushed her toward the doorway. Then he opened the door and kicked her backside with his boot, making her fall through and onto all fours. "Varn, please, take her into the woods where I can't hear you." Sinatra closed the door. Beth rose, her fear giving way to anger. She turned to face Varn, her hands forming into tight fists. "None of that!" He shoved her down the front steps so that she rolled into the sandy drive. This time, she stayed where she was. As much as her scrapes and bruises hurt, she mostly felt the sting of her stupidity. She couldn't fight him, not with fists. But there were other ways. A simple plan had begun to take shape. Varn was growing impatient and clutched the back of her t-shirt and prodded her toward the woods. "No use screaming," he said. "No one will hear you in the woods, and noise bothers me, like it bothers the boss. You cry out, I cut your tongue out." Another silence followed. Then, in a small but almost provoking voice, she said, "You cut my tongue out, and Mr. Sinatra won't get what he needs from me. Then he'll cut your tongue out." Varn said nothing. It was as though he couldn't believe what his helpless victim had said. But the shock wore off. He whipped her around and swung a mad backhand across her face, knocking her off her feet. Perfect, she thought as she went down. Blood pooled in her mouth, but her mind was absorbed with one thing. She got up slowly, protective of the ammunition in her hand. "Move, bitch!" She hunched her shoulders and trudged forward. As they got farther away from the cottage's light, they could see nothing. It was a moonless night. Varn warned her to stay still as he lit a match and looked for a path. But just as the flame was about to go out, he noticed her hand. "What's that?" She stared straight ahead as though she didn't hear him. "I said, what's in your hand?" He moved toward her. "Take a look." She held her hand just out of reach, and he instinctively moved closer. As he bent over, she flung the cloud of sand and gravel into his face and took off. "Bitch!" He started to yell more obscenities, but swallowed the words and stumbled after her. She ran like crazy, spurred by the knowledge she'd made a bullseye. She could tell by the dimming sounds of thrashing and cursing that she was putting good distance between them. With her arms outstretched to protect her face, she felt like she was running blind herself. But if darkness and sharp, piney branches slowed her down, a skinny teenager, they'd be much harder on a fat, tobacco-fed moose with sand in his eyes. The ruse had worked, and she silently thanked her grandmother's friend Norma for the idea. She'd overheard the feisty lawyer talking with Gran about trial strategy. "I call it loser's revenge. You let opposing counsel beat you to a pulp. Then when he thinks you're down and out, and he turns to take his bow before the jury, you shove a poison-tipped arrow right up his ass. Beth's handful of sand had been one hell of a poison-tipped arrow. She almost smiled, but renewed terror kept her face grim. If Varn caught up with her, he'd cut her. She had to find a way out of the woods.